Hi, I'm Michelle Segrest, and welcome to the Factory of the Future podcast.
This podcast is inspired by my 3-volume book series on the evolution of modern manufacturing. Each episode features engaging conversations with game-changing experts discussing the processes and innovations that are changing the landscape of modern manufacturing. Thank you so much for listening. Please do me a favor and leave me a 5-star rating on iTunes and take just a couple of seconds to leave a review. And then go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss a single episode. I'm really excited about today's episode. In episode 23 of this podcast, we talked with experts from Chicago's MHub Innovation Center for Hard Tech and Manufacturing Innovation. And today, I'm really excited to dive in deeper into that conversation with a fascinating man, Thierry Van Landegem. He's the Executive Director and IT Accelerator at Chicago's MHub. Thierry has vetted hundreds of IIoT startups for participation in his inaugural cohort. 9 teams will graduate from the program this November, most solving problems for the factory of the future. We're going to hear from Thierry about the early stage innovations that have impacted smart manufacturing and why investors are perking up around hard tech, and his thoughts on things like worker safety, robots, and data security. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Thierry's background. He's responsible for tech sourcing and evaluation, as well as program execution. He brings over 25 years of innovation leadership to MHub with a focus on creating sustainable business impact. He has extensive venture building and startup incubation experience in the telecom, IT, internet, mobility, and manufacturing industries, launching new corporate product lines, incubations, corporate ventures, and startups. He came to MHub after serving as chief incubation at global automotive solutions provider Metalsa's MLab, where he launched several incubations resulting in startups in the mobility and smart manufacturing space. Previously, he served as the COO and vice president of open innovation at Bell Labs, where he successfully led the Green Touch Sustainability Consortium, rallying 50 organizations to dramatically improve energy efficiency in communication networks. And prior to that, he set up Alcatel's venture organization in France, spearheading new business creation in telecoms adjacent markets. So as you can see, Thierry is very qualified to talk about all these fascinating topics, and I'm ready to jump right in. So Thierry, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Michelle. Great to be here.
It's fantastic to have you here. I'm so excited to learn more. So in the podcast that we had with your colleagues, with Bill and Melissa, we talked about what MHub is and what MHub is doing for manufacturers, particularly small to medium manufacturers and entrepreneurs. And so that was a fascinating conversation. But your area of expertise is setting up an accelerator. Can you tell me what the difference is and what that means?
Yeah, great question. And let me go back first to MHub. And if you look at what MHub has been doing for the last 4 or 5 years, is really attracting startups, hard tech startups. The main attractor was the fact that we have a huge prototyping facilities. If you want to prototype something tangible that you can feel and touch, whether it's metal, plastics, chemicals, electric, you name it, we have the equipment in order to do that. And talking to tons of startups in the hard tech space, that is one of the key challenges they have. They don't have the money to build these stuff, let alone to buy the prototyping machine. So they need somewhere to prototype. And that's what we offer as MHub. But soon we also saw that, once they have a prototype, they asked us questions in terms of how do I get to the market? How can I get more customers? How can I make more money? What is my business model? So a lot of ad hoc type of help and support for all of these startups. So hence the idea came to say, well, maybe we could do something more structured. And hence came the idea of setting up an accelerator, because here with an accelerator, we basically set up a structured program, and in this case, 6 months long, where we help a cohort of startups. So typically 8 to 10 startups, in our case for this cohort 9 startups, that we help in a program lasting 6 months that covers, call it customer discoveries, like who is that customer and what is the problem you're trying to solve. Once you get an idea of that, you need to make or build a solution and prototype that solution. So we help them prototype their solution, their product, and maybe also the service. And then, of course, we also help them in order to monetize that solution. That is, what is the business model? Who and how am I going to charge my customer for the product and or service that I give? And we do this in a cohort fashion rather than do it in an ad hoc way like we've done it in the past. Now, we'll say, this fact of having an accelerator, incubator, whatever the name is you give this, you have so many, in the US and globally. And yes, you're right, there's a lot of them, but there are very few what I call hard tech focused accelerators. And hard tech, let's be clear, it's a very fancy and cool and sexy name just to say it's hardware. Yeah? It's something that you can touch and feel. We are pretty unique because it's a hard tech accelerator. That's one. We have that prototyping facility where we can, together with the teams, build that first prototype or that second generation prototype, or even design the product for manufacturability, right? If you want to make a volume production, then you have to make sure that you do that in the most cost efficient and highest quality possible way. So we have that hard tech environment that we have. Secondly, very interestingly so is, better than anybody else, that fundraising for startups is a challenge, right? Fundraising for hard tech startups is even more challenging. Why? Because investors want fast return on their investment. Now, we all know building hardware, hard tech, takes time, costs more money, right? And don't get me wrong, it's not simple. Then rather than doing a software program, you have a laptop, you have access to the cloud, and you can get going, and you can do several iterations and software releases. In hardware, that's not the game. The game is a long-term game. It takes much more time to build something and do a new version and so forth. So it costs a lot of time and money. So fundraising for hard tech startups is way more difficult. Third, I also would say that we are offering the startups, the hard tech startups, the opportunity to collaborate with corporations. Mm-hmm. For each cohort, we have corporate sponsors, partners that will help the startups in this field to open doors to their supply chain. A big company has likely better supply chain capabilities than a small startup, right? Same can be said about access to clients, customers. Maybe the corporate is missing an element in its end-to-end portfolio, which the startup can fulfill. So a lot of good reasons why having that collaboration between the agility of startups and the depth and breadth of corporates is worthwhile. Finally, I would also say that we offer, as an accelerator, this opportunity to be part of that broader MHub community that my colleagues have spoken about. We are, I think, shy of 300 hard tech startups here at MHub. And just being part of that community is simply fabulous. I mean, you are amongst like-minded people that have gone through that difficult journey of starting up a company. So you can learn a lot just by walking around and talking about what you're doing. So these are, for me, a couple of reasons why I think our accelerator is pretty unique in that broader landscape.
Yes, that was a fantastic description of what's going on there. And I'll drop a link to the conversation I had with Bill and Melissa. So if any of the listeners haven't listened to that, they can go back and check it out. But I like the way Bill described this hard tech idea is if it makes a sound when it touches the ground, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about building hard tech products. That really gives you a good visual of what we're talking about here.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So you're using the term cohort, and I was just wondering if you could define that industry terminology for us.
Yeah, it's a good question. So when we talk about cohort, It's basically we are bringing together a number of startups that are working in the same field. I was talking about a hard tech focused accelerator. But even when you talk about hard tech, that's a huge field, right? And what we have been doing is trying to identify a number of areas where we feel we can bring the most value to the startups, as well as where there is a big demand, as in terms of, hey, there is a ton of problems in that field, and hence we want to help solve these problems. Let me give you the example. The first cohort that we are actually running, and that will end like in less than a month, mid-November, is one focusing on smart manufacturing. And smart manufacturing for me is what are the ways to make manufacturing more intelligent? And there is so many ways because there are so many challenges and problems. Think about making your manufacturing site more efficient. Think about ways where you can reduce the downtime of a machine. If a machine breaks down, then you can't produce anymore, right?
Exactly.
And you have to find what the issue is. That takes time. And then when you found what the issue is, then you say, damn, I don't have the spare parts for my machine. So I need to wait for the spare parts, right? And then when you have them, you have to put them into place. And then hopefully your machine can be put back to order. So you lose a lot of time, downtime, right? But if you can think about making your machine more intelligent, and more intelligent in the ways like you give your machine a voice to say, hey, I don't feel well. Just like a human being would be telling and going to the doctor, I don't feel well. Well, the machine, with its sensor capabilities, that intelligence I'm talking about, will tell the operators, like, I don't feel well, right? Because then we can stop the machine, or first of all, analyze why it is not feeling well, and then say, hey, maybe it's that part that is maybe not so well anymore, or on the verge of breaking down. We can stop the machine, immediately change, because we know which part it is. And so the downtime will be sharply reduced. That's what I call an example of intelligent manufacturing. And hence, if I can reduce that downtime, my overall efficiency goes up, right? As one example.
Yeah, that's the goal of every manufacturing facility, right?
Exactly right. But intelligence can be even much broader than that. I'm thinking about making the environment for the workers more safer, right? Because we know that accidents happen. It can also be helping the operators that are on the manufacturing floor, on the shop floor, help them do whatever they are doing. So there is many ways of doing that. And our first cohort are startups that are focusing on some of these issues, right? And so they are using technologies like sensor technologies that sense how a machine or how a worker or whatever it is on the manufacturing floor behaves. And based on some analytics of that data, we will take actions, because that data, that analytics gives us some insights which can trigger some actions, right? That's what we are trying to do. But next to sensors, you can also think of introducing robots, right? And robots are there already for a long time, but we are thinking about not only autonomous robots, but maybe also augmentation of the human being in order to, lighten the work which he or she is doing. But also so many other ways of making manufacturing more intelligent. So that's what we are doing. And the first cohort is one on smart manufacturing. The next cohort that we are going to launch, actually in a few weeks, will be focusing on a totally different area, but still hard tech, which is medical technology, right?
Cool.
Think about all the health and medical related vertical where you have devices, medical devices, which will help the human being or physicians in order to do what they need to do. A third cohort will be focused on energy tech and climate tech. But again, the hard pieces, the pieces, to Bill's point, that if you drop them, they make a sound, right? So these are some examples of cohorts. And because we put startups that are working on similar aspects together in a cohort, they can help each other. I am not just helping them. Our mentors are not just helping them. Our corporate partners are not just helping them. They help each other because they're working on similar fields. So they understand, they speak the same language, the smart manufacturing language.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And that's a great explanation. So I just want to review and make sure that I'm getting the right picture here and make sure that I understand. So the incubator is designed to help small companies or startups or entrepreneurs who don't have access to technologies or labs or things like 3D printers or people who can do marketing. They surround themselves in the community of people who have skills that are different than theirs without having to hire a bunch of people and invest in a lot of equipment. So that's kind of like the incubator environment. But then the accelerator combines similar projects, like, for example, those focused on smart manufacturing. And so it's the same idea, but it just brings together a smaller group or as you described, a cohort that's focused on this one thing. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I wouldn't focus too much on that terminology of incubator and accelerator. It's very similar. Incubator is more like you start from a napkin idea, the idea that you put on a napkin, and then you try to move towards something that takes shape. I would say that an accelerator is starting a bit later. There is more than just the idea of a napkin. You already have some design or maybe an early prototype or a proof of concept. So you have something. And the idea is with the accelerator, as the name says itself, you accelerate that starting up and scaling up process, whilst an incubator is really like an incubator. It's like from nothing, it gets to something. Accelerator is accelerating that. In both cases, they can work on a standalone basis or they work in a cohort fashion. Both can take similar approaches.
Okay, that makes it more clear. Thank you for that. But the whole idea is having access to resources that you don't have and building a community that helps each other to make their vision a reality and a success. So it's really an awesome community of like-minded people who have the same goals and want to help each other. So I love the idea.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not just the community. I mean, that is a big part of it. But given that we put them together in a cohort, during these 6 months, what I organize is I run some workshops myself, where I offer some frameworks, canvases, in order to think about how to best address new customers or prospects, how to build a business model, how to go to market and so forth. I do that myself, but I have other people that help me doing that as well. So we bring in other facilitators that are more focused or expert in a certain other domain. Like, for example, think about financial modeling, where you look at the unit economics. It's like, how much does one unit cost and how much revenue can I get from selling such a unit, right? Which is a whole modeling thing on its own, right? So in addition to these workshops where we bring some of the basics to the teams, I love inviting, speakers that come and join us, who come and talk about their journeys. I'm talking about speakers like CEOs and founders or serial entrepreneurs, that have done it. I always tell them, it's like, hey, you come here and Chatham House rules apply. So whatever you say here stays here. But talk especially about the challenges you had. We can read about all the successes. And I tell my folks in the cohorts, like, hey, do your research. Read about him or her, but ask, and I ask the speakers to talk about some of their challenges, like, hey, you know what? I had a co-founder and it didn't pan out. So, my lesson was, if you feel that it's not working well, you better get rid of your co-founder, right? As an example. But also the challenge they faced in order to get their first customer, their first pilot customer. And it is these stories that really stick,
It's stories, so true. It's so true. We learn so many lessons, so many more lessons from our failures. You always remember those even more than you remember the successes. That's where the really difficult lessons. I mean, if you have a failure that really has an impact, you're never going to forget it. And you're never going to forget how that felt. And you're less likely to repeat it. I want to talk a little bit about some of the other startups. We talked a little bit about smart manufacturing, but I know you have a group of startups who are focused on worker safety. And this is a big issue, I think, in particular with the challenges that COVID has presented. So can you talk a little bit about that? How are these startups approaching worker safety?
Yeah, and it's, I think, a topic that is very dear to my heart as well. Did you know, Michelle, that globally 2.3 million workers, operators, die per year? Worker-related accidents.
I mean, I knew the number was high, but I did not know the exact number. That's stunning.
That is huge. I mean,
Yeah.
if we can do something, to help that, to reduce that, that's phenomenal. And we have 2 startups that are really working. Well, actually 3, I would say, that are really focusing on building that technology in order to make the workplace safer. And I'm going to give you one example. So one team is really focusing on building technology that is computer vision based. So typically what they do is they have cameras, and whether you install a camera or whether you already have cameras in the workplace, it doesn't matter. You need cameras because they record, they give you a video stream. And what the team does really is analyze those video streams in order to create insights that then result in actions. So let me give you examples.
Okay.
One example would be, and you see a lot of accidents happen in these pressing machines. These like a stamping machine where you put a sheet metal and then you have a stamp and then it takes a form, right? How often doesn't it happen that hands of the operators get into that machine and are fatal, right? Well, this computer vision system has cameras that look at that workplace, and that can, based on analytics, create that insight of saying, like, oh my goodness, there is a hand before I stamp, so therefore I will not stamp. So instead of having that automatically done, assuming that the hands are not there, if it detects there is a hand, it will not stamp, saving the hand, as an example.
That's fantastic, sure.
But even further, it has cameras that look at the face of the operator and that can detect fatigue. And they will say, "Oh my goodness, Michelle on the on the machine there sound or looks a bit tired." It can indicate that what you will be a bit sloppy in what you do, and therefore we better say, Michelle, I think it's time to take a break, right? Rather than have you fall asleep, by way of speaking, and do stuff you're not supposed to do and resulting in an accident. So
it's amazing that technology can see that.
Exactly.
That is fascinating.
The fascinating thing about it is that a lot of people think that all the technology is there only to replace labor, right? That's like the general image, like, oh, robots and sensors, what, they introduce it and my job is gone. And yes, there is some of that for sure, but there is a lot of technology that really, what I can augment the operator, the human, augment by becoming more efficient, but also becoming safer in what he or she is doing. And that, I think, is phenomenal. I mean, think about avoiding those accidents. Not only the human sorrow that happens. I mean, if a coworker dies in a worker-related accident, that is dramatic, right? But it's dramatic not only for the family of the victim, of the colleagues, but also for the whole community around it. So if we can avoid that and all the costs, not only the emotional cost, quote unquote, but also the financial cost for the factory and the owner, but also for society at large, healthcare and so forth, this is phenomenal. So that makes it so attractive.
Of course. So bring COVID into the conversation. Are you working with these startups on ways to address the challenges that COVID has presented?
I would say in general, what we've seen is that some of the technologies that is being worked on, and that was both the case with MHub with some of the community partners here, Our startups here have done a phenomenal job in the early days of COVID, building some shields and respirators and so forth, just bringing together that huge knowledge, intellectual and prototyping capabilities to help, the community here in Chicago. What we've seen is that some of the technologies that are being built and have been built by the teams can also be used in that peer. Another startup that we are having in our cohort is also related to worker safety, but then more from a access perspective. So allowing people to come in or not based on certain criteria. And one example could be based on whether a person has a vaccine or not, right? So there was definitely opportunity for that moving forward.
You mentioned robotics, and I don't want to just skim over that topic because, of course, this is a big topic when we're talking about the factory of the future. And everybody does think about robots when you hear that phrase, factory of the future. But as you said, they're not replacing humans. They're just enhancing and making things easier for the humans and for the other people in the factory and for the factory itself. So tell me some of the things that you're doing in the robotics field.
I'm sure that your listeners have seen these videos on YouTube and other streaming channels of these little robots in big warehouses. These little creepy things that creep under a rack and then up their shoulders and move the rack, moving from A to B, right? Yeah. So this is well known and works well and helps the workers in the warehouses avoiding some of that heavy work. But if you go to the manufacturing floor, so the plant itself where production and assembly is happening, you don't see that much of these robots that move goods from A to B. And the challenge there is that goods and parts in production environments are typically on carts and pallets. But these carts and pallets come in different sizes and heights and weights and so forth. The warehouse that I started off with is very, it's very simple. It's like one type of rack, and therefore you need one little robot. Well, I mean, a fleet of robots, and they can all do the same. You go under the rack and up it, and then move it from A to B. In a manufacturing environment, there's pallets, big and small. What has to be done is the person goes with a pallet jack, puts it under the pallet, cricks it up, and then moves it from A to B. Or it is a cart and it pushes the cart back and forth. There is no robot that today is able to move these things, unless it is for one type of, device or cart or pallet. We have one of the startups that is building a unique robot, so an autonomous vehicle of sorts, right? Call it a mini Tesla of sorts, but which has a unique coupling device, that allows to move autonomously to either a cart or a pallet jack, connect to that thing, and pull it or push it from A to B. I mean, that is enormous. If we can get that introduced, and we are talking to lots of manufacturers which are really keen on that idea. Why? Because they see that a lot of time is spent by workers just moving parts and goods from A to B on the one hand. And additionally, you have all these pallets with goods that are somewhere in gangways and so forth. So a lot of space is taken by these pallets and carts. So there is this cost-related aspect on the one side, but also the humans that need to push and pull these carts that can be solved by these robots. So this is an example of where, again, we can reduce the cost overall because you can reduce space, or you can use space that is cluttered with carts and pallets by putting more machines in there and more humans that are doing real work on one side. And secondly, you can also reduce some of the cost associated to people moving these carts from A to B and have these people doing much more relevant work. So you're winning on both sides when introducing such robots.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. Terry, I'm really interested to know if you have any startups that are focused on environmental and social sustainability, because this is, of course, is a really important topics.
Yeah, we have one startup, Just Air. As the name says itself, it's like just air, but we want all to breathe clean air, right? And we know there is a lot of pollution. And when I met founders for the first time, it was like, yes, most of the cities have one or two sensors that sense the air in the city, and that gives you an idea of how good the quality of the air is. However, they told me, it's like, yeah, but that one sensor point, for a city like Chicago, or even if you have a few, that doesn't represent really what the air is for each typical neighborhood in that city. There is a huge disparity, and we see it now. The guys have pilot running in Grand Rapids, actually, where they have, I think, a bit more than 10 sensors in different neighborhoods. And what we see now is that if you look at on the same time, the same day, the same week, whatever, the same time, if you look at the results of the measurements of air quality, it's hugely different, depending on which neighborhood you're in. And that is because some neighborhoods are closer to a factory of sorts, or more traffic of trucks and idling trucks or idling buses or whatever it is. Some neighborhoods have less cleaner air than others. I mean, it's. I saw some of the readings where a sensor in a nicer neighborhood, with the park and so forth, clean air, and then you see another neighborhood at the same time, close to a public school, by the way, which had much more polluted air. So these guys are looking at doing more justice, quote unquote, from the environmental side by checking what the air quality is in different neighborhoods of a city. Because then you can, based on the insights you get from the data of these sensors, you can take some meaningful actions. It's like, hey, this neighborhood, the quality of the air is not good. So you can try to understand why it is not good and make sure that some actions are undertaken to make sure that the air becomes better, or have people, instead of children playing on the playground in that school, in that neighborhood with the polluted air, let them move to an area which is just a mile and a half away, which has much more cleaner air. So there is a lot of stuff to be done at a community level, but also at an industrial level, because we will know more about what these pollutants are, who these polluters are. And as you know, an industry is now much more focused, because of general society rules, I would say, in ESG, in environmental, social, and governance aspects. So they want to prove, these industries also want, and factories and companies want to prove that they are not big polluters. So I think it will help both ways. It will be a win-win-win for all stakeholders involved for the better.
Yes, I agree. And it just amazes me just how smart technology is becoming. But it's also, again, we bring in that human element of we have to be aware and we have to understand what's going on around us. But this is a really, really good segue to what I wanted to ask you next, which was about data. We're always talking about the value of capturing data, analyzing data, and then taking that data and doing something with it. And that's kind of what you're talking about here. But people are afraid of data sometimes because it's so vulnerable to attacks. So how do you feel about cyber security and how companies can protect their data?
As you mentioned, I think cybersecurity is a huge topic, right? Maybe not talking about the cybersecurity because that's a very broad and difficult field. But to your point, I mean, we all see and sometimes get messages of, one of the providers we are subscribed to who says something like, hey, we had a hacking of our systems and your personal data might have been hacked, quote unquote.
Right.
So we have seen and witnessed it, all of us probably. But think about the industrial environments where, to my earlier point, we make the whole manufacturing more intelligent, meaning we put sensors, we put robots, we have wearables for operators and so forth. All these devices, they create data that is then sent to a compute and storage facility somewhere, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud, it doesn't matter. It needs to travel over the air, and therefore it becomes vulnerable, because assume for a minute that not only in over the air, but even maybe in a wired, an attacker finds a way into that. That attacker gets access to critical information about the manufacturing operation. And that could be fatal, right?
Right.
Assume for a minute that something happens like that, it will even make our current crisis in supply chain and whatnot even worse, right?
Right, exactly.
Doing something there is extremely important. And one of our startups in our cohort, IOThic, is really focusing on that. It is introducing a protocol of sorts, a way of talking between these devices, the sensors and robots and so forth, and that compute facility that does the analytics, making sure that this transmission of data is hack proof, quote unquote, if that is a good word. So it makes sure that whatever you send from A to B cannot be hacked into. And that is based on more than a decade's worth of academic research. These guys are building that protocol, which will be phenomenal if this gets introduced into these critical manufacturing environments. So yeah, I mean, this is really another fascinating aspect. To your point, we can make the whole of manufacturing more intelligent, but we should make sure that we don't make it more vulnerable. Right? So
exactly.
Introducing intelligence needs to be done with the necessary precaution.
Thierry, from your perspective, and particularly with regard to smart manufacturing, what do you think the factory of the future looks like?
It's a good question. For me, if you look at the factory of the future, given all what is happening today, think about, the supply chain crisis. We have seen natural disasters. We see the effects of climate change. We have seen the effects and still see the effects of the COVID pandemic. It's clear that manufacturing and the supply chain needs to be made more resilient. And making it more resilient means making it more intelligent. I'm not Madame Soleil, I don't have the crystal ball, but I see something which is almost like a future where you have all these mini manufacturing plants, that are spread around. And so there is somewhere an idea of, maybe we need to have also a kind of very localized, very distributed, flexible, agile manufacturing infrastructure. And I'm thinking of something like the post offices. We used to have post offices in every village, or at least in cities, that very localized and distributed. Well, think of those, but as mini manufacturing plants that are doing some autonomous kind of manufacturing based on files that are downloaded. Think of it as huge 3D printers that are printing whatever you requested, and the shipping would be very short because it's locally produced, right? And that will be for some very simple things. You will still have these bigger plans where you need that combination of human labor and automation that we discussed, but they will be much more intelligent and much more distributed in nature. So I'm seeing something of that nature in the future.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I actually had another guest on another episode who talked about having more smaller plants, and this helps to solve some of the supply chain problems that are out there. So I think that's really insightful. I think you're onto something there. As we wind down and we get kind of to the end of our time, I could talk to you all day about this. I find it so fascinating, and you're really giving a lot of great information. But we are to the end. So I want to give you a chance to have the last word. So just whatever else you want to share with the listeners, maybe if I wasn't smart enough to ask you a question you wanted to answer, or just anything you want to share, we would love to hear your final thoughts.
I think my final thought would be one where, we have been talking about Industry 4.0 for more than a decade, and not much has happened since then. And we only see now the initial aspects of that. And I think it has been triggered by a time of crisis. In times of crisis, urgency matters, right? And we are seeing things change dramatically in the manufacturing world, in the supply chain world. And I think the sweet spot is there because we see also technology becoming available to make it smarter, more intelligent, where it makes sense to do what we do. And personally, I love to work on projects, endeavors that really matter, not just for me, not just for the organization I work for, but for the industry and for society in general. And I think what we are doing and working on here at MHub is really impacting and will impact much more society, you and I as consumers, tremendously in the future. So I think we're really up to something phenomenal.
I agree completely. Thierry, it has been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, Michelle, thanks. The pleasure was mine.
This brings us to the end of the show. Thank you so much for listening. Please do me a favor and subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on iTunes. If you have interesting information to share and want to contact me about being a guest on a future episode of this podcast, please send me an email at michelle@navigatecontent.com. You can also send me questions that I will have my expert guests answer for you on a future episode. And in the meantime, please check out my book series on modern manufacturing to read more than 30 real-world case studies about how global companies are using smart technology and innovation to build the factory of the future. All the links to the books and articles mentioned in this podcast are in the show notes. Have a great week, and please join me for the next episode of Factory of the Future.